Is it possible to erase someone from history? This is a tondo of the family of the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus. A tondo is the ancient equivalent of a family photo, that special moment when everyone gathers to save a memory for posterity. But this tondo has an important detail, which by now you must have noticed. One of the faces has been erased, and that face belonged to the Roman Emperor Geta. Geta was Caracalla's brother, and the two were proclaimed emperors of the Roman Empire when their father died. But this joint empire was a failure. Neither of the brothers trusted the other. They only met when their mother was present and with a military escort. A tense atmosphere lingered in the air, and they even considered dividing the Roman Empire in two. Until on December 26, 211, after unsuccessfully trying to assassinate his own brother, Caracalla managed to convince their mother to arrange a meeting in her quarters without the guards, so that the two brothers could make peace. Geta was coldly murdered by his own brother. This type of story of intrigue between siblings or family is not uncommon in history. What is uncommon is what happened afterward. With his brother out of the picture and the entire empire to himself, Caracalla condemned his brother's memory. Or, in other words, he ordered that he be erased from history. Mentions of his name were erased. Official portraits and busts were completely destroyed. Any trace of his brother's existence was to be entirely eradicated, including his followers. It is estimated 20,000 men and women were killed or exiled because of this. But today, 2,000 years later, we know the story. Not all of Geta's busts were destroyed. The practice of condemning someone's memory is known today as Damnatio Memoriae, and although the name comes from Latin, the first recorded use of it was actually in 1689 in recorded history. Today, the practice is understood not as a real attempt to erase someone from history, but rather as a form of punishment. What is worse than death if not the deliberate forgetting of the entire legacy someone indeed built in life? And we don't need to go far back in time to find similar examples. Stalin was known for ordering the execution of people from the Communist Party, and often removed people from photos and official government documents. After his death, the city of Stalingrad, which was the site of one of the bloodiest battles of World War II, was renamed Volgograd during the de-Stalinization process of the Soviet Union in the 1960s. But what do all these cases I mentioned and all the others I could have mentioned have in common? The fact is they failed. We know the history. We know what happened. We have records that prove the deliberate attempt to erase someone's memory. At least in theory, if a condemnation of memory were completely successful, we wouldn't be able to talk about or know of it in any way, because all records of the person's existence would have been entirely erased. And this raises the question once again, is it realistically possible to erase someone from history and practice? Now I paraphrase Yuval Noah Harari, author of Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow. History is made by a few people, while everyone else plows fields and carries buckets of water. The further back we go in the history of humanity, the more this statement becomes true. When we talk about ancient Mesopotamia, there are few individuals of whom we have records. Most of them are kings, people of prestige, or perhaps even the writers who wrote the texts. But although we know little about the individuals who made up Mesopotamia, we remember the civilization as a whole. So it is safe to say that most people who have ever existed on Earth have actually indeed been erased from history, simply because we do not have records of their existence that have lasted until today. And this brings us to another problem. One of our greatest inventions was writing. It allowed humans to extend their memories. For a long time, knowledge could only be transmitted from one individual to another. As writing evolved, we were able to significantly transform abstract concepts that existed only within brains into objects that existed in the real world and would continue to exist for much longer than the individual could. Stories could be passed down through generations. Knowledge was no longer limited to what an individual could store. Gradually, the accumulated knowledge of humanity was transformed into books. But books also have their limitations. They deteriorate over time. They are relatively expensive if we think about the amount of data stored, and because they are physical objects, they require transportation. And this is a problem for the transmission of knowledge. And actually, I can go much further here. When I say books, understand it as written records. It could be an official government document or a century-old company's accounting book. That is why it is also safe to say that the second greatest invention of humanity was the creation, storage, and manipulation of digital data made possible by computers. Since most of us were born after computers had already been invented, We don't have a real sense of how life and society functioned before them. It was precisely the digitization of data that gave us an enormous power to record things. From new births, historical events, to what you ate in your cheat meal, which became an Instagram story. In 2013, we reached a significant historic milestone. 90% of all data generated in human history was produced in just the previous 2 years. This means that in 2 years, we generated practically the same amount of information as millennia of history. And what this really means, at least from the perspective of this video, is that it is currently almost impossible to erase someone from history. You probably have emails, social media accounts, and likely a circle of friends who have definitely posted photos with you. To erase your existence, it would be necessary to remove any trace of you from the internet or databases, which is practically impossible nowadays. But here is a point to be explored. We can look at the entire data structure we have today and find it extremely solid and impenetrable. No information can be lost, right? This was probably what the Greeks also thought when they wrote on stones, believing it would last for eternity. Every method of storing information has its pros and cons, but almost no method we know today can withstand the greatest enemy of information: time. Stones wear down over time. Buildings turn into ruins. Digital information is susceptible to things beyond our control. In 1859, a solar storm known as the Carrington event generated the largest geomagnetic storm ever recorded in history. Auroras could be seen in the Caribbean, near the equator. Some telegraph lines ran only on the current induced in the poles, even after being unplugged from the electric power. If this happened today, in fact, most of our data, which is stored on hard drives, would be affected. We would lose the important information, and as a result, we would probably lose a part of human history. It could take us years to recover from the damage a single solar storm could cause, and that brings us to the last point of the video. No matter what humanity does or how well we store our data, we simply will not exist forever. Every civilization begins, reaches its zenith, and ends. Well, at least all the civilizations that have existed on Earth so far. Some endings are more dramatic than others, but sometimes the civilization continues to exist, just as a shadow of what it once was. It may be technically impossible to erase a person from history nowadays, but what exactly do we mean when we talk about erasing from history? Billions of people are alive on Earth. How many of them do you know? Probably less than 0.0001%. In the end, this video takes a direction that most living humans today try to avoid: death. There is a famous saying that you remain alive until the last person remembers you. For most of us, our existence continues until the day we cease to exist. Maybe a few more decades, depending on whether we have children or close relatives. Who knows, centuries, depending on what you did in life. There is a quote I like by the character Dr. Ford in the series Westworld, and it goes like this: Mozart, Chopin, and Beethoven never died. They simply became music. Most of us don't remember these composers as the people they were, especially since they are distant from us in the timeline, and anyone they interacted with no longer exists. But we remember the music they created. We remember what they did in life. And while there is someone listening to the music they composed, they will continue to exist. There will come a day when each of us will be erased from history, not because someone deliberately wanted it, but because that is the natural order of things. New generations come and replace the previous ones, but this shouldn't be a cause for sadness. This means that the actions we take, the decisions we make, and the people we love indeed matter today, in the present, and will truly continue to matter as long as we keep caring. And the day will come when humanity as a whole will be forgotten. That day is probably very far down the timeline, but the Earth itself will not survive the end of our star. And even when that day comes, and humanity is already present on other planets or moons, a part of it, its memory and what once existed, as if the universe itself were indeed condemning our memory. Damnatio Memoriae. Thank you very much, and see you next time.